good morning and thank you all for your presentations. And just to say that I'm the Disability Spokesperson for Sinn Féin. I'm not a member of this committee, but I'm a member of the Disability Matters Committee. So I hear from people sharing their lived experience every week. And a lot of the issues that you raise, I've heard from those witnesses as well. And just to say, I'm a white female with short dark hair wearing a white jacket and a black top. I'll leave out the age if that's okay. But just to say, what's brought up regularly with us, and you've alluded to it here, is sort of the supports don't follow the person and they have to reapply every time. So the issue, I suppose, around a disability passport is what's been brought up many times. And I think that would be a good idea because I come from the education sector. So if you receive supports in primary school, they automatically follow you into secondary school. And still something similar needs to happen here. But I suppose one of the issues was the attitude, and you referenced it there, of employers. We know within the public sector, say, there's a quota there of 3%, which is going to increase to 6%, and the NDA monitor that, though the NDA will point out that career progression within the public sector is very poor, and they're going to start looking at that as well because many enter it maybe at CA level and don't progress. But just on within the private sector, I recently engaged with an employability service, and they said the attitude in one particular area, in particular when they tried to get work experience for people with disabilities, was very poor. So I don't know if you have ideas on how you actually change the mindset of employers on a large scale. And even in relation to you talking there, the reluctance or the refusal to upgrade their websites to being accessible is terrible. But they are guidelines, so do they need to be reinforced and made stronger than just guidelines as well? Because again, the National Disability Authority said that they actually looked at all the local authorities and they graded them on how accessible their websites were, and they actually published it on their own website. And next thing, they were getting calls from local authorities, what do we need to do to improve so that we move up the rankings? So I thought when they were called out on how poor their accessibility on their websites were, they were willing to change. So I'm just wondering, is there something, I know it's a much bigger process when you're talking about private companies, but is there something that can be done there to incentivise them to improve?
It's about creating a situation where it's okay to talk about disability. It's not, as I referenced earlier, a bad word, and you can have open, frank, compassionate, empathetic conversations where you're not, as the person asking the question, called out for asking questions that are from the right place. It's funny, it's the anniversary of Yes Equality, the marriage referendum in 5 days' time, and it just reminded me that's what that campaign did. It created a space to ask questions for information to help make up your mind about what was a very important decision. But it allowed people to have those conversations without there being, why are you asking this question, or it descending into a negative thing. Yeah. So I think it's about creating a very positive environment that people, employers, need to be informed. They need to get over their fear. It's easier to walk away and just say, well, we won't hire someone because they're going to cause problems, or I'll be before the WRC, or all the worst case scenarios that people imagine. I think it's really important that that is created. And I think that the awareness raising campaign that is being talked about by the Department of Children will go a long ways towards helping that if it's done correctly, because it'll start that conversation, it'll start people thinking about it. And I think it needs to be wider. I think it needs input from other departments into that campaign. And people with lived experience, and make it the best it can be, and also answer, or at least create and spark the occasion where people can start having those conversations. You know, if you're an employer, why don't I have someone with disability on my team? If it's 1 in 7, the 7 of us, what are we doing wrong? What are we doing right? What do we need to do? What practices do we look at? And that's a lot of our work through Employers for Change and the Open Doors Initiative, is informing people and helping them on that path and imbuing confidence in both them and potential employees.
Yeah, I just
The only thing I'd add to that is, I suppose, the biggest thing in all this is we need to explain to people why. Like, you know, if I get into my foot in the door of an employer's organisation for even 3 minutes and can explain to them why they need to learn about disability, they will always come back and look for disability awareness training. Once they do the initial disability awareness training, they'll say, do you do any other training? We found that really interesting. That's actually really opened our eyes. We never realised that so many people were living with non-visible disabilities, or that there are so many people already within the organisation statistically who have disabilities. So the biggest, I suppose, barrier is actually, just like so many things in life, is actually getting our foot in the door to have those conversations. It's interesting about the websites. I've done a little bit of work with this in terms of Employers for Change with different organisations around their websites. I think a bit of the reluctance on that probably comes from lack of knowledge, and I think a bit more can be done to subsidise those changes. You know, we do a lot around retrofitting houses and doing all those things. So actually the scope there for us to look at, can we encourage employers to overhaul their websites with some type of incentive? And that's what I would probably encourage. But Jodie?
Yeah, no, thanks, Christabel. I would absolutely agree. Education is key. Get in there, educate businesses. We can do it in a fun way. We can do it using VR, you know, virtual reality now. You know, there's loads of ways of engaging people and really debunking those myths. You know, our advocates wrote a guide for employers. You know, it's okay. I have a sense of humour. You can say this, it's fine, you know, and I think all of that stuff is really important. Obviously, accessibility is key. And then you spoke to you know the fund and NCBI having to respond to that lag of applying for the fund. I might point out as well, applying for the fund, that's not accessible. You know, you have to get a scribe to come in and fill in a hard copy to post in, you know, so people can't do that independently. Same with the personal reader grant. However, you know, and then it takes months potentially for that person then to get their equipment or get the funding for the equipment. So like you've nodded to, people have to go to the credit union to get a loan. So NCBI have stepped in there to create this pot of money that we can give people interim independence with equipment. But it's absolutely, it's a cross-departmental approach that we need to this. But education is absolutely key. Did you want to speak about?
Yeah, just very briefly, you mentioned the NDA's report, which is fantastic, and it looks at websites. It doesn't look at internal systems. So from an employer's point of view, is all your in-house software accessible? Is your HR system accessible? Can you clock in and out? Can you send emails? Can you access documents? And that isn't been checked. So when someone goes for these work placements, people are starting to focus on their disabilities rather than their abilities because the systems they have in place are not inherently accessible. So if an employer starts concentrating on having, you know, inclusive software, making sure that their in-house stuff is accessible, it allows someone in employment to stay longer. Like, they're not just going to do an internship and then go, that was an awful experience, I don't want to do that again. It lets them to prove that they can work in these environments. So there's a certain onus on employers to make sure that their in-house software and their in-house systems is accessible. So there's not reports monitoring that currently. It's mainly just their external websites.
Okay.
It's also just a way we all look at the world, and this is sort of me grandstanding, but we work with the Cran Centre in Cork, which is a remote working centre, which was built fully accessible for people with all disabilities. It has a quiet room, it has raisable desks, it has space. And that thinking was at the very start when they started building it and raised funds for it. And it made me think of all the other remote working centres. A lot of them are not accessible. And it's a mindset. It's looking at the built environment. It's looking at wider society with a more inclusive lens and thinking, well, maybe if we're building that website, maybe we get someone in who knows how to make it accessible from the very get-go. There's no point in doing the retrofitting. We all know it costs more, it's more difficult, people shy away from it. We need to do it from the very beginning. And we're building new houses now. How many of them are going to be built for people with disabilities? I bet that isn't even in the thinking at the moment. I hope it is. I hope I'm very much wrong. But it means anything we're doing, anything we're working on, if you come at it from the lens of, well, how do I make it accessible? And that includes employment. How do we make employment accessible? So we don't look on people with disabilities as someone who's going to cause trouble or who's a drag or who's a drain on resources, who's a problem. We look at them as an employee who just needs that step up to be equitable with all our other employees, and treat them as all our other employees, you know, as someone who brings something to the organisation. So I think it's about a bigger thing than just the nuts and bolts of tools and equipment. It's about how we look at that and how we look at people with disabilities.
Just very quickly on self-employment, it's an issue that's brought up, and you've mentioned entrepreneurs and support for it. And the point is made to me all the time that if you're an employer and you employ a disabled person, you can access the wage subsidy scheme. But if you technically employ yourself, you can't. So can you see a way of that being changed? Is that something that could easily be changed? Or, I mean, you talked about the UK Access to Work scheme. I mean, do they have supports for entrepreneurs or self-employed people within that scheme? Or is this something that needs to be seriously addressed? Because, as you said, so many have brilliant ideas, but because the fear of losing secondary benefits like medical card and travel pass, or even just a basic payment because, you know, what they earn, it may take time to set up a business, or even in relation to people who work on commission like artists and musicians, that, you know,
Personal assistant support.
They need support. And they're even thinking, could they make a yearly return rather than, you know, being looked at on a weekly or monthly basis and then losing their payment, and then it takes ages for the payment to be restored and so on. So
there's no flexibility in the system.
Yes.
And a lot of it is paper-based, which is...
It's all paper-based.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. You have to, if you're self-employed, you have to fill in the hours you worked on a weekly basis. It's time-consuming, it's wasteful, it's not flexible. It doesn't allow any entrepreneurial spirit to thrive and prosper. It really doesn't. And correct me if I'm wrong, you don't have access to the supports, like screen readers or whatever.
The way things run at the moment, look, it depends. I think sometimes it probably depends on what entry office maybe, or who you speak to and how you write the application. But generally the rule of thumb is that the reasonable accommodation supports are applicable to employers for employees. So there's definitely a gap there from the entrepreneurs or self-employment side of things that absolutely needs to be filled. I'd also say that there's an opportunity for more support for people with disabilities to go into like your local enterprises and come from it from that aspect, that it's not all social protection. I think it would be important that the funds for individuals who have disabilities, who are entrepreneurs, come from the same stream as where other entrepreneurs are getting their funding. I'd also say that the wording that we're using is very, very poor in terms of uptake. So like when we talk about the wage subsidy scheme, one thing that we recommended with that was that we would increase it from being 50% of the minimum wage up to 70%. I mean, there's a cost of living crisis, we're all aware of that, so that's a big thing. But even the wording of that subsidy scheme, it's very demeaning. You actually have to sign off that the employee has a lesser capacity to work than others within the organisation. And nobody wants to do that. Like, I've spoken to employers who will say, I'm absolutely not doing that to the person. They're going to have to look at this form and agree to that. And it's often not true. So I don't think that would really be applicable either to a person who's self-employed or an entrepreneur. But certainly I'm not 100% from the entrepreneur side in terms of the UK model, but it's certainly something that we could look at.
Yeah. And just... I mean, employment is not just about getting people into jobs, it's actually how you get them there, and important. And transport, I think somebody's mentioned that only 6% utilise public transport. I mean, there's been no personal transport support schemes, really, you could say, since 2013. Okay, if you were in receipt of those prior to 2013, you can continue to receive them. But since that, there's only the disabled drivers and disabled passenger scheme, which is extremely difficult to access. So that is actually ruling out a lot of people who live, particularly in rural areas, but even in urban areas, if they can't get to a bus stop or a train stop. So, I mean, again, it needs to be cross-departmental, all of the supports put in place, and so that gives people the dignity of being able to go out to work, you know, without having to fight for everything that they require. And I know you mentioned there, a lot of people have hidden disabilities, and I just know in my former job there was a number of people who, there was a confidential survey on disability, and many were reluctant to fill that out, especially if they had something like mental health issue, because they felt or feared they would be stigmatised as a positive. So we have a lot of people maybe in the workforce who are working without the supports that they need because they're afraid to actually admit that they have a disability.
Deputy, actually, what I'd say about that, and what's interesting about your point about people's reluctance to respond to those type of surveys, I think that that's probably a huge obstacle in terms of the reporting within the public sector. And I've tried to work with the number of semi-state bodies on this around the language that they use when they're actually collecting data on the number of individuals within the organisation, or percentage of individuals within the organisation who have disabilities. As things stand, it's quite medical and clinical, because actually the surveys that are shared literally just take the Disability Act 2005 definition of disability, which is very short and doesn't really encompass all of the disabilities that people might be living with or how they might self-identify. So I think there's a lot of work even within the public sector around the language that we're presenting to our employees to actually encourage them and give them the confidence in the organisation to share that information, and not just be kind of a box-ticking exercise, and so that people feel like, well, we're asking this information because we want to create a more inclusive organisation.
Yeah. Transportation and access to work, you know, particularly rural, people living in rural areas, access can be hugely challenging. Rural bus stops could just be a bus pole in a really middle of a busy road with no island bus stop. Even if you do have a good access route, with the advent of shared spaces and micromobility, navigating is becoming extremely challenging for people who are blind or vision impaired. There's no there's no tactile markings between a cycle lane and between a pedestrian pathway. There might be an island bus stop in between, scooters flying past, electric skateboards, you know, things that are actually not audible or might make an unusual noise that people might not recognise. So these are all additional challenges that people are facing as well.
The recent primetime episode that aired around disability, for anyone who hasn't seen it, it'd be a really, really important thing to watch. It's on RT Player, but within that, what Jodie just mentioned there was a young woman on it who lost her sight, I think, at about 10 or 11 years of age. And she talked about the state examinations, and actually the state examinations are only allowing for the Leave Insert an extra 10 minutes for her for each of the exams. And I just thought to myself, well, immediately, how is she meant to reach her full potential in terms of her qualifications to get into the type of work that she might really dream about getting into? And I think that's as far back as we need to go. Like, we need to think about our young people, because it's at that point we're really forming as adults and understanding what are our abilities and what are the obstacles we're going to face as we move into the workforce later in life.